Well, welcome again to God's Prophetic Surprise. We're studying the book of Revelation. If you're new to us, that's what we do. We've got 100 shows, and we're in Revelation 8. And we're studying verse by verse. Get a Bible out. Dr. Jon Paulien, if you're new to us. Viana is a pastor in Calamasa, Pastor Shifra at Campus Hill close by. I'm at Garden Grove in Orange County here in California. So if you weren't here before, we've been studying the trumpets. We're in Revelation 8, so get a Bible out, and we're here. I have an anecdote for you. Are you ready?
Ready.
So here's a story from old preacher stories about the train that crashed into a truck or something. And so it became a dispute. Did the guy in the caboose send a lantern signal or not? Famous story. So they went to the court and they brought him up and they said, did you signal with your light, with your lantern? Yes. So they said, yes, okay. So on the way out of the courtroom, he whispered to his friend, they didn't ask me if the lamp was on or not. Famous story. Are the trumpets God's warning? To the world, we're coming to closing time. I'm not going to let you hit the last days without some clear-cut trumpet warning. Or is it a prophecy of something 1,000 years before Jesus comes? Or is it a warning here at the end? So now we're studying darkness and the world falling apart. Are we right on the edge, or is this really a long time ago, or both? We were on this question at the end last time. Is it literal? Is this darkness, spiritual darkness, where God's clarity is withdrawn and people are living in darkness? Is it some sort of cosmic eclipse or something that is blocking off all the third of the light? Anyway, I don't know if we're going to answer that, but I'm hoping to answer by the end of the show. Or are you ready for some commentary right now?
We can bring up the issue of hermeneutics, which is an English word drawn from the Greek language. That means basically the science of interpretation. And I think at the root of the science of interpretation is the biblical principle that God meets people where they are. That means if God gave revelation in 95 and not in 1995, his initial purpose was for specific people on the ground at that time. And the images of Revelation were designed to be understood in that context rather than ours. A lot of people come to Revelation and run with whatever it strikes them. But the problem is, you're reading Revelation through the filter of your time and place, and it was written to another time and place. So before we try to make sense of it for today, we need to understand what God's original purpose for it was, or we may misunderstand.
So they're sitting and reading, hearing someone read this book to them, and they hear about darkness, that there's going to be a day somewhere in here where there's going to be a third of the sun, moon, and stars is all going to go dark. And so they'd be looking at future somewhere.
And don't forget that Revelation 1:1 says that this vision was signified through the angel to John.
Yeah.
So that the vision is a figurative from the beginning. That's simply the way that it was set up. And the model for that figurative is Daniel 2, because Daniel 2 is quoted right there in that context. So you go to Daniel 2, and it's describing a sequence of events, but in symbolic language. It's not a movie of the future. It's a symbolic description that leads one toward the future. It seems to me clearer texts like Daniel 2 ought to guide somewhat what we do with less clear texts like the trumpets. So is this literal or is it figurative? We would have to go to the language that's there and see how it was most likely to have been read when it was originally given. Is that at all?
I'm happy with that. I think we should just give credit where it's due. I'm teaching a class. Are you teaching Revelation now in Sabbath school?
Yeah.
You know, so anyway, I teach a pastor's class, and we're doing a study which is written by Ranko Stepanovich, who was Dr. Paulien's student, and that is in the first week about the Simeon, the sign. And I, in classic name dropping, said, I do a TV show with Jon Paulien, who was a teacher of this one who wrote this in here. And we went over this in our TV show, so I just wanted to give credit. I think the guru of Revelation studies, and people in Philippines, where I just was in the seminary, are still following the studies that come from Dr. Jon. And now the whole world is studying the book of Revelation in one quarter.
Really
and as
cool.
we are taping this, that's what we're in the middle of.
Right.
So anyway, I agree with all that. Well, pick it up where we were, John. You were going through texts from the Old Testament and then into the New.
Yeah. We looked at several allusions to the Old Testament, allusion to creation, an allusion to the Exodus, an allusion to Ezekiel 32, that there would be a new Exodus in which Egypt would be destroyed in the context of darkness, etc.
And Psalm as well, where darkness and blindness.
Now here's an important hermeneutical consideration, just quickly. I hope I don't digress too far. But many people would look at Ezekiel 32 and say that never happened literally. Therefore, it will happen in the future. This is a Protestant tradition. A number.
One more time. What would not happen literally?
That Ezekiel 32, since it didn't happen literally, therefore it will happen literally in the future. So most of the Old Testament prophecies are thought by some Protestants to be shoveled over into the future, and that's where you get a rapture of the church. You got to get rid of the church, and then God re-embraces the Jews as a literal people, takes them back to Palestine, and that in the Middle East, all these prophecies will be fulfilled once again.
So they were conditional prophecies that were not fulfilled in the Old Testament, but will be fulfilled literally to Israel. So that's why they have place names and things that are all based upon that.
That's what some think.
Okay.
And so if you read Ezekiel 32 literally, you have two options. Either that prophecy was never fulfilled, or it is yet to be fulfilled. And some of our Protestant friends take that other option. What leads me away from that, and we're talking hermeneutical principles right now, what leads me away from that is the realization whenever the New Testament quotes these Old Testament prophets, it does so with Jesus in mind, and it does so spiritually. And you have bunches of those in Revelation. For example, we saw in Revelation 1, you have that thing about every eye will see him.
Every knee will bow.
And all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him, and all the rest of that. That's Zechariah 12. And in Zechariah 12, it's a literal prediction of what would happen in Jerusalem and in Judea in the near future. Didn't happen. So the New Testament has the option of just saying it didn't happen or applying it to the future. And the New Testament consistently does that symbolically, figuratively. Now Jerusalem is the church. Judah is the church. God has become Christ, and so on. So the Zechariah scene is now reinterpreted in the light of Jesus Christ and of the gospel. And our Protestant friends who look to see it literally also see Revelation as being not addressed to Christians, but as being addressed to a Jewish context in the future when Christians have all been taken away from the planet.
How do we sort it through? I mean, the sixth seal, which we studied here, we take literally. Sun, moon, and stars. Heaven's opening up like a scroll, mountains and islands moving. We took all that literally. Is there a hermeneutical principle that distinguishes between those kinds of references, and the others?
Because the text itself pointed us to that. You had a series of host passages in the Greek in which something figurative is grounded in something literal. It's interpreting something literal in a figurative way. And so what's prior to the host would be literal. So you have, so what I would say about Revelation 1:1 is Revelation is to be taken figuratively unless it is plain that the literal is the right way to do it. And I think in the in the fourth trumpet, there's one thing that's clearly literal. It says that a third of the day might be kept from shining and a third of the night. Are there figurative meanings of day and night that would fit this passage? I don't know of one. So Jesus Christ would be another example of something that's clearly not a symbol, but lamb is a symbol, you see. So the book of Revelation is naturally to be read symbolic unless there's overwhelming evidence that you have to take it literally.
Just to be clear to our audience, that is the opposite, the flipping of our usual hermeneutical principle.
Exactly.
Most of the time we would say we take it literal unless you're forced to go symbolically. In Revelation, you flip it.
And you flip it because the introduction to the book says.
It signifies.
It signifies.
You know, a comment, when I was reading a little bit further into chapter 9, there's almost like a personification of a star, right? A star falls down, which at first you're like, okay, stars fall, that's falling star. But then it says it was given the key. So now this has to be more than just, you know, going to Joshua Tree National Park and seeing a falling star. This falling star was given a key. So is this symbolic language? I, you know, tend to think yes, it must be. And then still in chapter 8, verse 13, even before that, it says, I heard an eagle that was flying saying in a loud voice. So an eagle is saying in a loud voice, which I guess it could be literal, but most likely that's figurative, right? Yeah. And then just to comment on your hermeneutic, I also don't want to digress. I thought of Jonah and how Jonah was given very clear words to say to Nineveh, the whole city, that Nineveh would be destroyed. There was no condition. It just said, the prophecy was, you will be destroyed. But then that doesn't actually happen, does it? And Jonah gets perturbed because of the mercy of God when Nineveh decides to gamble on the mercy of God. So then I think there are clear instances where prophecy doesn't happen because of God's mercy. You know, so it doesn't necessarily mean that it will happen. It has to take place at some point, whether it's the future or then. But the mercy of God is like a wild card.
Good.
Nicely put.
I got one more question before we go on, Jon.
Could I speak to hers?
Yes, please. I thought you were done.
Jeremiah 18 is, I think, the clearest text in the Bible that explains what happened in Jonah. So if you go to Jeremiah 18, verses 7 to 10, I'll be reading the English Standard again. If at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck up and break down and destroy it. And if that nation concerning which I've spoken turns from its evil, I will relent to the disaster I intended to do it.
I love that. Thank you.
That could have been the last verse of Jonah, but it isn't.
Okay.
Then verse 9, and if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build and plant it, and if it does evil in my sight, not listening to my voice, then I will relent of the good that I had intended to do to it. Now this is a caution to us prophecy hawks. We love to get the future down. We love to know something ahead of everybody else that feels good, but sometimes it's flat out wrong. Not because you read the prophecy wrong, but you didn't take into account God's freedom and his mercy.
Awesome.
You see?
Really cool.
So whenever we talk about the future on the basis of prophecy, we need to keep in mind that God is merciful and that God is creative and that sometimes prophecies are fulfilled in ways we didn't expect because circumstances change and God makes adjustments.
Hallelujah.
And I say that on the basis of fulfilled prophecy, which you can see over and over again. I think I've mentioned in this group Isaiah 11, where there's 4 pieces to a prophecy and not one of them is fulfilled the way it says. And yet it's clear that that prophecy was fulfilled because circumstances changed.
Wow.
Excellent, excellent.
So it's not to discourage people from studying prophecy, but to say the clearer the prophecy is to you, the more careful you should be that you don't overstep your pay grade and make predictions beyond what the prophecy says. You know, well, this nation's going to do that to this nation because I saw it in this text. I get that kind of stuff all the time.
Oof, that'll preach.
And it's Jeremiah 18 is a good antidote to some of that.
I listened to a good TED Talk this week. They used the phrase intellectual humility.
Yeah.
I said a little intellectual humility once in a while. So here's my question, Jon. If Exodus is at least allusion or echo or whatever word we want to use, and these plagues are the precursor to setting up a stage to be able to leave and go to the promised land. Now we bring that down to a group of people reading this text in the first century. But the people leaving to go to the promised land is a couple thousand years later. And so this is what, a few days here, and these acts led right away to getting out and Passover and going. Now we're talking about a very long time. How did they interpret this passage where these judgments and all these symbols are going to be setting up a stage so we can go to the promised land? I mean, that's still where we're trying to head. How do you work with that?
Either of you want to address that?
No.
No? Well, I think one would address it.
My pay grade.
Yeah. I think one would address that simply by saying that God has always depicted the future as near. That doesn't disturb me a bit.
Yeah.
He's always depicted as near. You go to Matthew 24, and Jesus says, when you see this, when you see this, when you see this, when you see this, you will know that it is near. Everything he said happened in the first century. And that's why Jesus says, when you see these things, know that it's near. John says in Revelation, it's near. Doesn't it? Chapter 1, the time is near. So the book of Revelation, the New Testament, depicts the potential for Jesus' return as being near in the first century.
Wow.
New Testament doesn't give you 2,000 years. We read it through the lens of 2,000 years because what?
We're 2,000 years.
We're 2,000 years later. Yeah, you see. So when you're dealing with prophecy, you've got to start. You're going to misread the prophecy unless you read it the way it would have made sense originally. When you've done that, then maybe you'll have a clearer window on what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day and down the line of prophecy.
So if we apply these prophecies to 1,000 years ago, could Christ have come 1,000 years ago? Could those dark days spiritually have then led to Jesus coming? I mean, could he have come at any of these trumpets in history?
Well, it reminds you of a text that talks about hastening the coming. If we can hasten it, then it could be sooner than it will.
Could have been.
Could have been sooner than it is.
Okay. Go where we need to pick it up now.
Okay,
We
yes.
digressed a little.
That's all right. I think that was an important digression because one thing I'm seeing in the discussions over the Sabbath school lesson for those who are experiencing it at this time, one of the discussions clearly is a lack of understanding of hermeneutics, a lack of understanding of how you approach a book like Revelation, and so we make all kinds of assumptions and judgments that ends up in fights, and fights over the 24 elders, I don't think is what it was intended to be there for. If people are going to die on the cross of the meaning of the 24 elders, you could have picked a clearer text.
When you publish your final magnum opus on Revelation, will you have a chapter at the beginning of just hermeneutics to help establish that?
I've already published it. It's called The Deep Things of God.
Okay, but when you do will you incorporate that again so that when people read the whole book, they will read it through that beginning?
I suppose that's the introduction to the commentary that is yet to be written. Yeah,
yes.
I would want to do that, or at least say to people, read this first. If you're going to read my commentary, read this first. If you're going to refer to it, you still want to read the other first.
So that's different from the 7 keys?
Yes.
So we really need both of those.
Is a short commentary, about 100 pages. But the deep things of God is step by step saying, how do you read the book of Revelation in such a way as to leave open the possibility you might learn something.
Okay, excellent. I will go back to that.
We tend to read the Bible to confirm what we already believe. That's natural. It's easy for me to do that.
Sure.
You know, and to actually lay aside my need for a certain outcome long enough that the text can actually say something to me is a very complex task, even for a scholar. And for people who aren't scholars to assume that they've done that well, you know, it comes across sometimes as arrogant and foolish.
Okay. I shared the 7 keys with my class the first week, but I did not do the deep things of God. I'll go back and get that.
That's the hermeneutic. I even have checklists. If you want to do word studies, for example, here's the process, and there's check marks. You know, here's the process.
Nice.
If you want to discover Old Testament allusions, check, 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 check. Here's the process that you go. So it's very detailed, and also includes a chapter on fulfilled prophecy and its implications.
Wow.
Fantastic.
So yeah, that's maybe the most important chapter. Number 2 for those who have the book in hand for some reason.
Good. Okay, so let's go back. We finished with Exodus and Psalms and all that.
So we came to realize that the allusions in the 4th trumpet are not that helpful to understanding. So we went to the echoes, the language. How does that language play? And we looked at darkness and discovered that it goes back to creation. It's a symbol for judgment and punishing sin. It looks forward to the upheavals of creation, you know, at the end of the world, etc. But we noticed that in the intertestamental period and in the New Testament, light and darkness are used in symbolic ways most of the time. And they're symbolic of the gospel, symbolic of rejection of the gospel. Light and darkness represents the battle between good and evil, all right? So it's possible that the darkening of the sun, moon, and stars here is intended to be a symbol of something else that God is doing. I think this gets clearer when you go to the sun. 1/3 of the sun was struck, all right? So let's look at some Old Testament texts. Psalm 119, 105. Psalm 119 and 105. I think that's the only biblical chapter where you can have 6 figures in your verse. And here we have one. So who would like to?
Your word is a lamp to guide me and a light for my path.
All right. So the Bible is this imagery of light. Represents the scriptures and its role in our lives. Proverbs 6:23.
I'll read it. For the commandment is a lamp, and the teaching a light, and the reproofs of the discipline are the way of life.
All right, so here again, the concept of light as opposed to darkness represents the Word of God. It represents the teaching of God. Psalm 84:11.
The Lord is our protector and glorious King, blessing us with kindness and honor. He does not refuse any good thing to those who do what is right.
What translation is that?
Today's English version.
Okay. I would call that interpretive. Does someone else have a different reading?
What was yours again?
Today's English version.
So New International, for the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord bestows favor and honor. No great thing does he withhold from those whose walk is blameless.
See, the word here is clearly sun, S-U-N, and while the interpretive translation is helpful in context, it's not helpful to us at the moment because we would totally miss that this is saying the sun here is not literal. The sun is protection, you know, that God places over our lives. So the sun then is understood figuratively as representing the Bible, the gospel, God's intervention in our lives.
Quick comment. I often think about how we need protection from the sun because of like my beach days. And so like, protect yourself from the sun rays, you know. But when I think of your story in the game park from last episode, you know, in the dark, the sun gives you protection because the sun, like in Psalm 119, is a lamp to guide you and a light for your path. So that was really interesting because if I read in today's context in Southern California, I need protection from the sun. But if we think about it in terms of dark and light, the sun gives you protection when you're in darkness by guiding your path.
That's right. So moon and stars, I'm not aware of any particular figurative significance that would relate to this text. And I've, you know, gone through them one by one, etc. Day and night, as I mentioned, doesn't seem to me to have a symbolic meaning as such. So the question then becomes, what do we do if this is figurative and the context of Revelation and the context of these echoes of the Old Testament would point in that direction? What do we do with it? And we'll have to come back to that next time.
Is there any evidence that the darkness is something that God uses as a judgment?
Oh yes, all through the Old Testament.
Are you gonna point to some of that? Because some of the darknesses are just you were in darkness before you came to Christ. But God didn't do that. You did that yourself, or you grew up in a place where there was no God. It's not God saying, I now am going to give you darkness. But there are some texts like that.
Well, yeah, and you know, one example was the Psalm 69:23. And we could look at Isaiah 5:30, for example, and Isaiah 53, and Ezekiel 30:18, and Joel 2:2 and 3. So yeah, darkness is, in the book of Deuteronomy, it's one of the consequences of breaking the covenant. And so when you get Day of the Lord passages, darkness is almost always there.
Interesting.
And very, very strongly involved. So yeah. As I said, in the Old Testament, these things tend to be taken literally. And what Revelation often does is take the literal things of the Old Testament, like Israel, Jerusalem, you know, the land, etc., and give them a Christ-centered meaning. And I think Christ needs to be the center of how we interpret Revelation. It is, after all, the revelation of
Jesus Christ.
Guess who?
Jesus
Christ, you see. So if we don't put Jesus at the center, we might be missing what's happening.
Cool.
Wow.
We're hanging, Jon. We want the answer.
We'll get back to it next week, right? Got to give people a reason to come
Give
back.
us another week on the fourth trumpet. Okay, so we're studying light and darkness and the fourth trumpet and how that will all come together. Please come find us. Look on your schedule. Put a trigger on your phone so that you're back with us so we can wrap this part of it up. We're glad you found us on GPS, God's Prophetic Surprise. God bless you all.